Welcome to Chapter 2, which is all about physical processes. In this chapter, we are going to go over things such as plate tectonics, weather and climate, and topography. For each region that we look at this coming semester, we are going to briefly discuss these physical processes for that region, and it will give us a good setup for how it affects each region. So this chapter will serve as background for those physical processes. Our next chapter, Chapter 3, will be about human processes. And so here we have a picture that I took in Argentina, in Patagonia, looking at a couple of mountains. And so obviously this topography, right, is very mountainous, and there is a bunch of clouds rolling in, and there's a variety of vegetation types that are happening in this picture. So we're going to touch on a little bit of that in this chapter. If you have taken physical geography or plan on taking it in the future, you are going to learn a lot more about these processes. So when we talk about these physical processes, we're looking at a variety of spheres. And so there are interactions between land, water, the atmosphere, and life, and they are all important to humans. We can talk about the lithosphere, which is the surface of the earth. And so when we talk about topography, we're talking about the lithosphere. We can talk about the atmosphere, which is where all of our weather takes place. We can talk about the hydrosphere, which is all the water on the planet. In the physical geography class, you would learn not only about atmospheric moisture, but you'd learn about the seas, rivers, glaciers. And the last is the biosphere, which is the global ecological system that incorporates all living things. So we'll touch upon each of these a little bit during this chapter. One of the first things that I wanted to talk about was plate tectonics. You may have learned about plate tectonics in the past, but the Earth's crust is divided into large plates. This includes the continents and the ocean floor. And so if we look here at this map, Antarctica is on the Antarctic plate, but the Antarctic plate extends well beyond the boundaries of Antarctica. And these plates are moving and interacting. They're moving in different directions and interacting in different ways. Those interactions create landforms. So the Earth is constantly eroding away and making itself anew. Most of these things happen at very large time frames over geologic time. So most of it we don't even notice that is going on. But there are a few things that we do notice that are going on, mainly in the form of earthquakes and volcanoes. So there are consequences, both good and bad, for people with these plate tectonics. A lot of volcanic soil is really rich and really, really great for farming, but obviously living next to an active volcano presents its own problems. And so we have many plates, some large and some very, very small, throughout our planet, and they are moving in different directions. So in Southern California, we have the Pacific Plate, which covers Baja California and part of Southern California, and then the North American Plate, and they are kind of pushing into each other and moving alongside each other. And in the Pacific Northwest, we have the Juan de Fuca Plate, which is actually being kind of eaten up by this North American plate. And so generally speaking, where you're getting these plate boundaries is where you're getting new landforms and earthquakes and volcanic activity. And so if we want to think about what countries have experienced major earthquakes in the past several years, we just had one in Mexico very, very recently, which occurred right on the edge of the Cocos Plate and was felt into Mexico City. We had a major earthquake in Haiti in the past several years that was very, very devastating. And then the earthquake in Japan that caused a major tsunami in 2011, which was right along the Pacific Plate boundary. Many, many people are living in something that's called subduction zones, which is a particular type of plate boundary. When you have oceanic crust, which is being pushed underneath another plate, oceanic crust is much heavier than continental crust. This only happens along the coast. Not every coast. Certainly the west coast of California has a subduction zone on it, and this can cause earthquakes. You can see here in Japan on the bottom, we have the results of an earthquake where the earth moved considerably and this road has kind of been snapped in half. And we also get active volcanoes. So that Juan de Fuca plate up in the Pacific Northwest, Mount St. Helens, which erupted when I was a kid, is alongside along that subduction zone. We have almost 1 billion people living along subduction zones. And so knowing about them and being able to predict their activity is very, very important. You are going to watch a short video after you watch this lecture that is going to have some footage of the Japanese tsunami that when the Japanese tsunami happened, they have a very good warning system in place. So despite the fact that 16,000 people died in the Japanese tsunami, it would have been much, much worse without this early warning system that they have in place. Um, People live along these subduction zones because coastlines are very advantageous places to live and were places that were settled early due to access for water for trade. And also on the coast, we tend to have milder, nicer climates, so it's a much nicer place to live. And again, that volcanic soil for farming. After volcanoes erupt, that soil that they create is just super rich for farming, and so we have a lot of farming happening in subduction zones. We have a particularly active subduction zone surrounding the Ring of Fire. And so the Ring of Fire extends around the west coast of the United States through out part of Alaska, down past Japan, and through the Pacific. And so this is a particularly active volcano, subduction zone where we have a lot of volcanic activity taking place. Next, we're going to talk about topography. Topography is the surface of the Earth um, and the surface configuration of the Earth. Is it flat? Is it hilly? Is it steep? Is it jagged? We're going to talk about this a lot this semester. Very often, a particularly mountainous topography will actually form the boundaries of some regions because it will prevent a lot of cultural exchange from happening or trade. If you're at a higher elevation, that causes you to have colder temps, right? So you go up, if you were in San Diego County and went up into the mountains, the temperature would go up, would drop fairly dramatically. You're also going to get more rain and more snow. You also get the creation of rivers. So most rivers are originating in mountainous areas. When we talk about uh, Sub-Saharan Africa has very little mountains, and therefore they have um, very few navigable rivers. They don't have these wide, deep rivers where ships can go up and down them. The next thing we're going to talk about is weather versus climate. They are two different things that we very frequently talk about as the same thing, but they're not. Weather is present atmospheric conditions. So in Southern California, very often sunny and warm and nice outside. But weather changes constantly, especially where I grew up in Connecticut. The weather definitely changed quite constantly. Climate is average atmospheric conditions, and so it looks at things like seasonal patterns, but we're taking a bunch of weather events and we're averaging them together to talk about the type of climate. And climate changes very gradually. So when people talk about climate change, we are talking about changes to those averages. So we're talking about warmer than average summers or wetter than average winters, depending on your location. Climate can also tell us a lot about a place. So while this could be the weather in Las Vegas, where there's snow on the ground, that can certainly happen there. This is more indicative of the climate in Las Vegas, right? Very warm, which is one of the reasons why it's become such a vacation hotspot. There are many global climate types, and we will not go through them in this class. You would in a physical geography class. We live in a Mediterranean climate in Southern California over here, which is named after the Mediterranean, which also has a Mediterranean climate type. So we have warm, dry summers with cooler, wetter winters. but generally speaking, not a lot of precipitation as a whole. There are several main determinants of climate, and I'll go through each one here. The first one is latitude. And so if you live at a lower latitude or closer to the equator, you're going to have warmer weather than if you live at a higher latitude or farther away from the equator. The next one is elevation. Again, I mentioned that if you go up in elevation, it's going to get colder and you're going to have more precipitation. Continentality or distance from the coast. If you live near the coast, you're going to have a more temperate climate. Water heats and cools more slowly than land, and so it has this nice tempering effect on climate. So you're going to get much bigger temperature ranges the farther you are away from the coast. Pressure patterns, which we would learn a lot about in a physical geography class, but we have global pressure patterns. And so some areas live in areas of consistent low pressure and they have lots of rain. And some areas are in areas of consistent high pressure and they have drier weather. Wind patterns. We have global wind patterns. And if your wind is coming from across a continent or across an ocean, that can have a great effect on your weather. That topography, again, if you're living on a mountain or in a valley, you're going to have very different climates. And when we're talking about climate, we're often talking about precipitation. We have a great varied amount of precipitation, even in our own country, but especially throughout the world. You think about the amount of precipitation the Sahara Desert gets versus the Amazon basin. So there are three main determinants that go into determining how much precipitation an area is going to get. The first one, again, is that atmospheric pressure and precipitation patterns. And so we have these huge convection cells of air pressure that kind of encompass the entire Earth. They go all the way around. And so near the equator, we have consistent low pressure from heating. And so we have very wet weather there near the equator and also at the mid-latitudes. And so the mid-latitudes for us in the United States, think about the Pacific Northwest. Then we get high pressure areas that are consistently dry. We have them in the subtropics, subtropical highs. You can see a big one here that goes right through the Sahara Desert. And at the poles. The poles are actually deserts. They are frozen, but they are not really getting any precipitation. And we have seasonal changes in pressure patterns. So we can see here kind of going back and forth between summer and winter. And that star right there is a place in Brazil that has retreating savanna, depending on the time of year. So it will get very green, much like the African savanna, or quite brown. And so there's a link after this lecture to a Google Street View. And in that Google Street View, up at the top left, you should be able to change the month when that was taken, and you can notice a great difference in variation. But this changes in pressure, these pressures cells that are kind of moving back and forth, they're shimmying back and forth, has to do with the tilt of the Earth and the uneven heating that it gets. The next thing that affects precipitation is wind direction. And so we have prevailing winds in areas that are blowing in from a particular direction. And if you are getting prevailing winds from the ocean, like you can see here in Taiwan at the bottom, you're going to get very wet weather. If you're getting prevailing winds from the land, like you can see here in Namibia, you're going to get very dry weather. So even though this part of Namibia is right on the water, you're getting not very much precipitation because those prevailing winds are traveling across the continent. And that last is topography. And so we get more rain in mountainous areas because we have wind that blows into a mountain range, and that air is pushed up, and then it cools and clouds form, and rain falls on that side, on the windward side of the mountain. So the windward side of the mountain is wet. Here we can see it in San Diego County in Southern California. On the leeward side, it's dry because that moisture is never making it past this mountains. So we get the leeward side where you get deserts on the other side, and we can see this pattern all over the globe. And next, we're going to talk about biogeography. Biogeography is how climate and landscape affect what lives where, especially vegetation. Most often, biogeographers work with vegetation simply because even all the animals in a region on the base of that food chain are dependent upon vegetation, and vegetation is very much dependent upon climate type. So we can see 3 pictures here. On the bottom, we have desert shrub. We certainly have vegetation there, but not a lot, as opposed to a coniferous forest, or at the top is a Mediterranean climate, which is what we live in. Biodiversity refers to the number of species in an area. And so we have places on the planet that are biodiversity hotspots that are particularly biodiverse. Southern California is a biodiversity hotspot. We have some of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the continental United States. And so humans are constantly altering biogeography and biodiversity. Generally speaking, when we move in, biodiversity drops, and this can be a problem because ecosystems that are more biodiverse are more resilient. If something comes in and shocks one species, it's not going to destroy the entire ecosystem because there are lots of species within that ecosystem. And so if you look at the relationship here, the top map is climate types and the bottom is vegetation types. And this map is not perfect, but you can see that very often those climate types and those vegetation types line up quite well because that vegetation is a function of climate. So that is the end of the first part of chapter 2. And now you're going to watch a short video about that's showing that Japanese tsunami coverage. And you're going to click on that street view in Brazil in order to see that change in vegetation. And then you're going to move on to the second part of chapter 2.